I'm Henry Lee. I'm the director of the Environment and Natural Resource Program at the Belfer Center, one of the sponsors of the Energy Policy Seminar, along with the Mosava Rahmani Center for Business and Government and the Harvard University Center for the Environment. Let me open with a few reminders regarding the logistics of our virtual seminar. We are recording the seminar and we'll post it on the seminar series website. So if you have a friend or a colleague who missed this talk, please let them know that they can watch it later on our seminar webpage. And we have registration links as well for our upcoming seminars in this series. Just a reminder that we will take questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. So please click on it at the bottom of your screen and submit your questions. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Priyank Lathwal. Priyank is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Belfer Center in the Environment Natural Resource Program and the Science, Technology, and Public Policy Program. He holds a doctorate in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University, where his research focused on decarbonizing freight transportation and was supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation. His current research focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from energy use, particularly looking at the United States, India, and China. Priyank, thank you very much.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks for the kind words. I'm thrilled to be here. Let me just share my slides. Perfect. All right. So good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking about freight trucking in the contiguous United States, and more specifically, thinking about what are the related air pollution related public health damages and the environmental justice implications of the same. As we know that long distance freight transportation has been a hard sector to decarbonize. What you see below is an image from an article that appeared in Science a couple of years ago. The wedges which are protruding out are the ones which represent sectors that are hard to decarbonize. So if you think about freight transportation, long distance road transport, aviation, and shipping constitute approximately 6% of global fossil fuel emissions. So it's been a sector which has been relatively hard to decarbonize. And when we look at the United States specifically, transportation is the largest source of GHG emissions. And within the transportation sector, heavy-duty trucks account for roughly a quarter of domestic transport emissions. So as you can see in the image, this is a projection by the EIA. Transportation overtook electric power industry in terms of GHG emissions a few years ago, and going forward in the next few decades is projected to be the largest contributor to GHG emissions. With that background in mind, diesel freight trucks, in addition to GHG emissions, are also significant contributors to criteria air pollutants. These include oxides of nitrogen and fine particulate matter. Having said that, freight trucks are essential for the US economy. The latest commodity flows survey numbers show that roughly 43% of the total ton miles and 70% of the total freight domestically is transferred by freight, is plied through by freight trucks. These criteria pollutants have linked to premature deaths and also cause chronic illnesses such as lung cancer, heart disease, and asthma. Domestically, PM2.5 mortality burden in the US is approximated to be 85,000 to 200,000 premature deaths each year. So, historically, there has been a lot of regulatory policies that have placed a lot of focus on reducing emissions. However, who benefits from those emissions? There has been very little guidance on that. There are efforts in the current administration which are trying to promote that, but this has been the lay of the land when we started working on this area. There's very sparse literature on freight trucking impacts. There was a paper which came out last year from Tessam and co-authors that looked at some of these impacts on disadvantaged populations. However, since we were able to compile a data set that looked at absolute emissions from trucking, we thought of conducting this study. So essentially, this work contributes to existing literature by resolving freight trucking emissions across all continental United States. We also quantify the extent of air pollution health damages that counties are importing and exporting due to freight trucking activity. Thirdly, we also evaluate the change in emissions from shifting part of the tonnage from trucks to railroads. And finally, we think about what are the distributional effects of air pollutant emissions from freight trucking on demographic subpopulations. So the data which we use comes from something called the Freight Analysis Framework 4. It's a publicly available data set by the Federal Highway Administration. As you can see on the image on the right, this data set is comprised of 450,000 miles of different types of roads that consists of interstate highways, intermodal connectors, urban and rural principal arterials. So now this is a broad summary of the approach we use as part of this study, and I'm going to spend the next couple of slides trying to unpack this. Essentially, there are three major blocks in our modeling approach. The first one is estimating freight trucking emissions at the county level, which is shown by boxes in blue. Secondly, estimating the associated monetized public health damages from those emissions, that's shown by blocks in red. And thirdly, tying these results to demographic information, which we have available from the US Census Bureau. As a first, in terms of estimating freight trucking emissions, we use the annual average truck volume and the length of the road segments that come along with the FAF4 dataset. We combine this with lifetime mileage weighted emission factors from the GREET model. For those who don't know, GREET is a model which is updated on a yearly basis by the Argonne National Laboratory. So combining these two data sources allows us to compute freight trucking emissions for each road segment. And when we aggregate these road segments in a particular county, we get freight trucking emissions at the county level. In order to estimate related public health damages, we use reduced complexity models. And the model which we use is called EASIER. And I'm going to spend the next couple of slides talking a bit more about it. Essentially, what it gives us is it divides the entire United States into grid cells. And for each grid cell, it has an associate value in terms of marginal damages in dollars per ton for different types of criteria air pollutants. So we use those marginal damages, combine them with the emissions that we got from our first step to estimate monetized air pollution social costs from freight trucking. Now, we do this at two different levels. The first is we calculate these social costs in the source counties, and we also distribute these damages across different counties for a period of a year. So that allows us to calculate air pollution related health damages in receptor counties. So as I mentioned, what are reduced complexity models? These are a set of models. The ones which we are using were developed at Carnegie Mellon by Dr. Jinyo Kyo, who's at CARB right now, and Professor Peter Adams. The one which we use is called EASIER, that provides total damages from area sources at source location. And it's basically derived using a regression which was done on results from a CAMEX, which is the chemical transport model. It's also accompanied by a source receptor matrix called APSCA. Now, APSCA allows us to disaggregate these social costs across the continental United States by population weighted plumes. So just to give a feel for things, this is how they think about dividing the entire continental United States in grid cells. And for each grid cell, we have an associated marginal social cost for different criteria air pollutants. So I extracted all the ground sources from the model results, and this is what it shows for different pollutant types. Here's what we see for PM 2.5 for all. And here are some results for SO2 social costs for all ground sources. Essentially, what we end up doing is that we use these social costs and combine them with our freight trucking emissions. So once having done that, the third step of our analysis combines these results with the US Census Bureau data. We do this analysis both at the county and the census tract level to estimate distributional effects across ethnic and racial groups. So with that, here's the first set of results. Essentially, what we find is that NOx and CO2 emissions from diesel freight trucks are a non-trivial share of total US emissions. What you see in the table are results of emissions which we have aggregated from FAF4 data set. And we have also benchmarked it with the latest national emissions inventory, which is available for the year 2017. As you can imagine, given the differences in methods, there are some differences in terms of the estimates we get from both these data sets. But for the most part, it reconciles for NOx and CO2 values in terms of the total percentage contribution from trucking emissions across both data sets. So next, what I'll be doing is I try to spatially distribute these emissions at the county level in the United States. What we find is that PM 2.5, SO2, and NOx activity emissions are mostly concentrated in counties in the northeastern, southern, and western United States. As you can see in the image for different criteria air pollutants, this broadly holds true. I'm not showing CO2 plots here, but they follow a similar emissions profile. Now, when I look at these activity emissions and look at the freight flows on US road network, we find that they roughly correspond to these freight flows on the road network. These flows are from the year 2017, the ones which you see in the image, but for 2012, but what you see when you project them out for 2017, they become even more denser across these different road networks. Having estimated the emissions, next, as I mentioned, I'll be computing the public health damages from freight trucking. So in order to do that using the easier model, we found that there was roughly $11 billion in public health damages from NOx, both at source and receptor counties. So as you can see on the image on the left, these are damages which are expressed at the source county. Now, what do I mean by that? For example, Suffolk County, the plot on the left to Suffolk County itself, all summed up at Suffolk County. On the right-hand side, you see damages at receptor counties. These are damages which counties are importing from all other counties, including the damage the trucking causes to the county itself. So that's all summed up at the receptor. So we do this for other criteria air pollutants too. When we look at fine particulate matter, that roughly amounts for $5.5 billion in damages, both across source and receptor counties. One interesting thing you might notice between the plots which we showed previously around emissions and damages is that the damages seem more diffused compared to the activity emissions, which were more across the road networks. And that's because damages travel across adjacent counties and other counties. We do the same exercise for sulfur dioxide emissions. And given the ultra low sulfur fuel use, these damages are lesser. They're to the tune of $100 million, both at source and receptor counties. Now, having gotten both the exported and imported damage, I thought I wanted to find out what's the net ratio of exports and imports across these counties. So I divided both of these damages and expressed them as a ratio to see which are the counties which are importing and which are the counties which are net exporters of these damages. So as you can see in my analysis, I find 55% of all counties in the US were net importers of freight trucking related public health damages. There were few counties which are net exporters, many of them located in Texas, parts of North and South Dakota. Yeah. Next, I also thought about, well, if we wanted to shift freight from trucks to railroads, would there be any benefit to that? I must caution that this is a zeroth order assessment. We didn't have actual data to look at where these tracks are located, but to the zeroth order, we find that this allows us to reduce sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide emissions substantially. Also, using a social cost of carbon of roughly $51 per ton, trucking contributes to $30 billion in climate damages due to CO2. Next, as I mentioned, that we do this analysis both at the county and the census tract level. Having gotten the results which I showed you previously, I combined them with US Census Bureau data. So the regressional specification which I run is for 3 pollutant types, PM 2.5, SO2, and NOx. That's my dependent variable. And on the other side, in terms of independent variables, I take proportions of different population subgroups in respective counties, along with the area of the county and other parameters such as the median income of the household in the county. So when I run this regressional specification for different air pollutant types, I find that there is more pollution emitted in counties with higher proportion of Black and Hispanic residents. I show the regressional specifications and results here. As you can see, these numbers were observed to be statistically significant. And we also do a lot of testing on another emissions inventory, the national emissions inventory, and come to similar conclusions. Now, there was a research paper that came out in Science Advances in 2021 that looked at PM 2.5 population weighted exposure on minority groups at the census block group level. Now, since we had the data for emissions and actual road information, we were able to determine which roads were located in which census tracts, and therefore compute emissions in respective census tracts and ran the same regression specification at the census tract level. Now, once we did that, we found that the effect persists. Again, more criteria pollutant emissions were occurring in census tracts with higher proportion of Black and Hispanic residents. So to sum up, in terms of findings of this work, we were able to determine that criteria air pollutant activity emissions were concentrated in counties in northeastern, southern, and western US. In terms of quantifying the related air pollution public health damages, we find that these include roughly 17 billion in criteria air pollutant damages and 30 billion in CO2 climate damages. In terms of shifting, thinking about if we were to shift part of the tonnage from freight trucks to railroads, we find that there is an argument to be made in terms of reducing sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide emissions. From our distributional effects analysis, when we look at census level data, we find that there are more freight trucking emissions that occur in counties and census tracts that have higher proportion of Black and Hispanic residents. So having found these results, I think a natural question to ask is, what are the policy implications of these findings? I think as the United States looks to go forward in the next few decades and achieve its net zero goals, we need to strike a balance in reducing carbon footprint in terms of bolstering economic growth while creating additional jobs, at least in the freight trucking sector. And more generally, this is applicable to all sectors. In terms of monetized public health damages, our findings indicate that freight trucking is associated with roughly a third of total transport-related air pollution damages in the US. So in that sense, there are a lot of efforts which this report supports. Some of them I mentioned here. EPA's Cleaner Trucks Initiative is thinking about trying to have a heavy duty rule introduced in 2022 to reduce these emissions. In terms of promoting the zero emission vehicles by replacing the diesel fleet of existing trucks, I think that's also coming along. General Motors released a 2035 plan that they'll be selling net zero tailpipe emission vehicles by 2035. I guess the third point is we need to support infrastructure investments in intermodal shifts and moving freight from trucks to rail. I think this is crucial in the short term until we have the right technology and innovation to get to zero emission vehicles. I think in the short term, we could try to figure out ways how we can shift freight from trucks to railroads. The COVID pandemic really showed us how supply chains are crucial for meeting a country's requirement for necessary goods. So in the near future, as some supply chains shift to domestically, I think having a robust intermodal freight infrastructure would be really helpful from a supply chain security standpoint. Thirdly, thinking about there could be an argument, and I think efforts are going on in thinking about what are alternative fuels that could allow in terms of decarbonizing freight trucking operations. In terms of the demographic analysis, I think this work and adds to the dialogue which is building up around the environmental justice and equity issues. The Infrastructure Act Justice 40 initiative from President Biden ensures that part of those benefits are realized in communities which have been historically disadvantaged. Recently, and I think this will pick up more traction in the future where such tools will become integrated in government policy making. However, there is precedence in some of this in California's environmental justice tool and EPA's environmental justice screen. So with that, I would like to acknowledge folks who were helpful in terms of helping me produce this study. I'm really passionate about this area. And so, this was a meme I found. So I thought might as well share it with other folks, would have a laugh. And with that, I will take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priyank. We have a lot of questions and you've touched on a lot of really interesting issues. I guess one of my first questions is that if you look over the last 30 years, you find that a lot of freight was shifted from railroads to trucks. The sort of fault for this seems to be that it was more cost effective and more efficient to run the freight by trucks. So if I switch this freight back to railroads to reduce emissions, is there a significant efficiency penalty?
I think in terms of efficiency on a per ton mile basis, railroads are the most efficient for shipping freight. However, it also depends on the nature of freight and the kind of commodities that we want to shift from trucks to railroads. Um, in recent news, we have seen that there's this divide where much of the public highway infrastructure is publicly owned, thinking about roads and bridges, but the railways operate on a privately owned basis. So there have been discussions around how they might want to get both these on an even basis. So thinking, what comes to mind is Secretary of Transportation's um, consideration of a tax on a vehicle miles traveled basis rather than on a gasoline sold basis.
For financing green transport infrastructure.
I'm sorry, Henry, your voice broke. Could you repeat the question?
Okay, sorry, is that, I'm here at the Kennedy School and it keeps telling me that my connection is insecure, which leads me, if it was home, I'd have a different view, but all right, let me go one more time. What are your views on putting a levy, a carbon or an air pollution levy for freight trucking in the United States, and a redistribution mechanism attached to that levy? So the revenues go to the counties which are air pollution net importers, and that money could be used for financing green transport infrastructure.
That's a loaded question, especially for like someone who analyzes policies like me. I think there's a distinction I would like to make that we can, in my personal view, if we were to go that route, I think that's plausible in terms of making the argument. However, there is a barrier between policy analysis, the science and technology wall, and what actually ends up happening more on a social and a political basis. So I think that's something which I wouldn't want to comment on in terms of what will actually happen. I guess as a researcher, my goal is to think about these issues. But I think it necessitates the discussion and doing some analysis around which one would be better for what. And equally important is to realize that assuming if we were to go that route, which communities will be the most benefited? If you look at air pollution reductions historically in the US, fine particulate matter has declined overall across the country. But relative disparities amongst communities have persisted. So think of a county which was most polluted in 1980, it's still most polluted amongst the top 5 counties in 2016. So, I mean, this is something which I'm quoting from a science paper, which I'd read a few years ago. But then, so like you have to think about these considerations in addition to, when we think of a policy outcome.
But on the other hand, a lot of the reason that these counties are most affected, if I looked at your slides, is that a lot of the highways intersect these counties. And therefore trucks go on those highways, and I can't move the highway. So my option seems to be to try to clean up the truck fleet. And you, are you a big advocate of electrifying the truck fleet?
I think it depends. The answer to your first question, I agree that it's hard to move a highway which has been part of, the interstate highway plan by President Eisenhower. But historically, there has been some form of conscious bias in citing these highways across communities. When I was working on the environmental justice aspect of this analysis, there's a deep and rich literature that illustrates many of these issues historically. Now, in terms of so I think like while we acknowledge that we might not be able to cite those highways in the current funding from the Infrastructure Act, we may want to think about like how we want to expand or cite future highways, and what are the implications of that. Just giving representation to a community in a local government or having representatives on a board is not enough. I think we also need to think about whether they're being heard about their issues. So, I mean, there are a couple of interstate highway projects, which where they're thinking about taking the highway out and like turning it into more like a courtyard or something like that. So yeah.
I'm going to ask you a couple of technical questions.
The second part, answer to your
Yep.
question around electrifying trucks. I think it depends. If you're thinking of short haul, it's possible. In terms of long haul, heavy duty freight applications for trucking, I think with the current, with the current energy densities, there's still way to go there.
But on the other side of it, what is General Motors considering when it says it's coming out with zero emission trucks?
I mean, I'm pretty sure like they are innovating on the inside. However, a lot of it also depends on the durability of climate policy outcomes under different administrations. So I think now we have a supportive administration, which really wants to take the climate challenge head on. And which is why I think, they'll get more support in terms of innovating in that arc. So point being that, it has to be a combination of innovation from industry, supportive policies and incentives from the government, and also involving community if you really want to go in that route. Now, that holds true for any technology. In this context, we think about electrification.
Okay, so you think electrification is feasible for heavy trucking?
I think my position there is that I'm cautiously optimistic. However, I'm also of the view that it'll be a polyfuel world out there. It won't be a monofuel world that only one technology will over others. I think when we think about different contexts and thinking about mostly at the global level, you're going to have to consider sectoral context that you're thinking about the countries, the budgets they have in terms of deploying infrastructure for different fuel types. So a lot of considerations that need to go into that.
Now, I have a few technical questions that have been posed, and I'm going to read you a couple of them. It says, what are the pros and cons of your easier model as compared with the model most economists use, which is the AP3 air pollution model produced by Professor Nick Muller? Are you aware of Muller's did you think about comparing this model to some other models, the easier model to others?
Yes, yes, I'm very much aware of Professor Nick Muller's model. And in fact, I took a class with him when at CMU Tepper as a doctoral student. And we do benchmark our results against the AP3 model. I wish I had a supporting slide for that, but I can show you some of those comparisons here. So if you look at when we reconcile numbers from AP3 and easier, we find that, broadly they are still they're aligning in terms of the findings when we run these emissions across both models. Now, generally in terms of advantages and disadvantages of reduced complexity models, I think that there are a lot of uncertainties involved at different steps of the process. When we think about reduced complexity modeling. In my view, I think if we have the resources, we should do a CTM. That's like state of the art. However, I was only one person and we didn't have a lot of, time, and like CTM can be computationally very expensive and prohibitive in that sense, which is why we thought, okay, let's do a RCM and go with that and benchmark it with other RCMs.
The second technical question, have you tried regressing the damages on demographic variables?
I haven't tried that approach, but I think since this is, this paper is in the works, I would love to do that and get back to the person who asked the question. Let's see.
And finally, how are the marginal costs of such criteria pollutants as PM 2.5 and sulfur dioxide determined?
I mean, that's something they do in the background, but I think, so PM 2.5 marginal damages are higher, compared to say sulfur dioxide damages. So if you were to compare the three damages on a per ton basis, depending on the context, so PM 2.5, NOx, and SO2, that's the order generally. When we think about, how are these costs distributed, a lot of it, they look into what is the atmospheric chemistry that is available across these different counties and for a given period of time. And then they find these these damages from those by running that. So I think, there is literature out there where, there are papers which detail these models in depth, but the best I know, this is what I can recollect.
All right, one more. Models such as EPA's BenMap-CE assumes that the value of each avoided hospital admission is $5,000, and that's hospital admissions from air pollution exposures. This is most likely undervalued cost, given the differences across the country. How did your model deal with this factor?
So I think that's an excellent question. In our analysis, we are looking at only effects that relate to premature deaths. However, there are other effects. CDC comes up with an estimate around, folks who are hospitalized. And so overall, this is a conservative estimate. The actual effect of freight trucking is probably higher if you look into, hospitalizations and other illnesses which might not immediately require an hospitalization and yet cause damage to human health.
Would you expect that for example, the number of people who are hospitalized due to COVID-19 who have lung damage coming in because of exposure to these pollutants, that would be an added cost, particularly over the last 2 years?
I think so, yeah. I did read a paper around this, but I would imagine that for folks who have already had lung damage and got exposed to COVID, I mean, that is an additional cost.
Let me just ask one of my own technical questions. Is a lot of the NOx emissions end up being cooked in the atmosphere and combined with hydrocarbons and become tropospheric ozone. And tropospheric ozone has a substantial health impact. How do you migrate the NOx emissions over to the ozone emissions and the health damages from the ozone?
I think that's something which the person who created the reduced complexity model took care of. In my analysis, what I get from reduced complexity models, having done all that background work, what's the dollar per ton damage for, say, PM 2.5 in Boston versus the dollar per ton damage for PM 2.5 in Pittsburgh. So they do definitely take those considerations into account. And since these are regressions which come from a CTM, and then they do also validate this by in-sampling and out-of-sampling methods.
So if you were advising the present administration on a disproportionate burden borne by disadvantaged populations, what would you recommend?
I'm sorry, Henry.
I know it's just
the middle part of the question.
Let me try one more time. To what extent have you or others looked at the cost of policies to reduce SO2 and sulfur and particulate emissions, and the extent to which these costs are disproportionately borne by the disadvantaged counties?
I think we haven't done a lot of work on that front, but there is work out there. I know from literature from EDF and others. In fact, the Net Zero America study does a projection that how many deaths can we avoid if we are going towards a net zero future. So in this specific analysis, we haven't done that work, but I think that's a great, interesting future work question to ask under different policy scenarios. What would be the benefits in terms of reducing these air pollutants?
When I looked at your model, those maps that you put up, one of the interesting conclusions is that the impacts are in the Northeast, I think the South and the West, but not the Midwest. And yet so many of the highways go through the Midwest. Why is the impact in the Midwest less than the other three regions?
Let me just see that. I think like the short answer to your question is that it's got to do with something with how they are projecting the wind direction and how the assumptions the modelers are using in terms of population weighted average plumes. Yeah, I think that's what's happening there. Like, I think a lot of that affects what marginal damage function they have for each of those counties and associated dollar monetized damages.
So a lot of the pollution in the Midwest is transported to the Northeast is basically what you're telling us.
I mean, if I were to go back and look at that, I would just take the difference between imports and exports across these two regions, and I would be able to produce that number. But
okay.
Yeah.
I also noticed on the map that you left out Long Beach and Los Angeles, which are major sources of truck pollution. But anyway, it's curious that it's states on the map not covered. That would be.
I think that's an underlying limitation of the FAB4 data which we had.
Yeah.
It didn't have adequate coverage for California, so which is why you don't see a lot there.
All right, another question. The United States is a laggard among developed economies in regard to the decarbonization of railway transportation. Have you considered estimating the reduction of emissions if trains ran on electricity and or hydrogen? How would it change your results?
There has been a paper on this a couple of months ago in Nature Energy, which looked at, if we were to electrify trains, what is the penalty, what is the emissions reduction? And in my view, I think it's great that you have decarbonization across different sectors. It's a function of priorities and budgetary constraints. So if you have railways, if you have trucks, if you have other sectors, ships and ports, obviously we want to decarbonize all these operations through different technologies available. However, in terms of prioritization, trucks is something which we should focus first, because as it is, the emissions footprint of railroads is relatively lesser on a per ton mile basis. So I would try to sort of, if I were in the government, I would try to prioritize in that manner.
One of the guests has been watching what has been going on in Canada and asked the question is, could a version of your model be used to calculate the pollutants associated social costs attributed to the trucks now occupying Ottawa and which block the bridges between Canada and Detroit?
Yes, I think in the current form, the model is being expanded into a global easier by colleagues who developed this model. There are other models out there, such as InMap, which have already come out with a global version. So you could use that model and run these emissions to estimate these impacts in Ottawa.
So damages depend on population. They are lower in places of lower population density. So if that's the case, wouldn't that explain some of your findings?
Yes, so I think population density is a big factor in terms of how these damages are attributed across these centers. And it's also interesting because how future population and urbanization will grow in the US. And that's also something which will govern like how these damages are expressed in the coming decades across different geographical regions.
And you aggregated all this data by county. Did you ever think of doing it by state as well?
So I actually, I had data both at the census tract level, county level. I use county level populations. I basically find out that in that grid cell, what proportion of each county is in that grid cell, and do a population weighting and an area weighting there to come up with these estimates.
Okay, let me go back to my question that I gave you a few minutes ago. Is that if I'm trying to help these counties that are disproportionately exposed to pollutants from freight trucks, I was thinking in my mind, Riverside and San Bernardino in California, where there's two major truck highways. They go right through these two communities. And the levels of pollution are higher than really any other area around Los Angeles. And Los Angeles has very high pollution. And I wanted to make a difference there. I wanted to help these people. What would you do? I'm getting very, location specific here, but if I suddenly put you on a plane, sent you out to San Bernardino, what would you tell people?
I think first I would like to, it has to be a multifaceted approach. First, thinking about the technological options we have around, deploying in ports in that area. Like, is there a way to decarbonize freight operations within the port by electrifying some of that equipment and cranes and things like that? The other thing is we would want to, engage with the communities to see how we can, for folks who are just in the front line of these areas, like right there, I've been reading a lot on New York Times how this has been called the Death Valley in some sense around when you come from an air pollution standpoint. So try to figure out ways if we can, I don't want to say rehabilitate, but temporarily shift until such time by which the pollution becomes better there by the interventions which we are deploying in the port area. Now, however, that is a sensitive issue because people like where they like the place where they are. They have a house and a community, so they don't want to do that. So I would definitely want to prioritize technological and legislative measures first from the government before trying to actively ask the community to relocate or something like that.
But again, when we talked about technical alternatives, you felt that electrifying trucks was maybe the best option, but you were somewhat hesitant to fully embrace electric trucks. There are also hydrogen trucks. There's also trucks that might run on forms of biofuels. If you were to look at ways that the federal government, either through its R&D programs or through its policy programs, could move the trucking industry more towards one of those three options, electrification, hydrogen, or biofuels, where would you put your emphasis and how would you do it?
I think in the short haul category, like the question which you asked around, populations being exposed to air pollution, if you could have electric trucks which ply through the short haul routes, especially in areas which have high population densities, I think that's plausible and feasible in terms of, right now the cost might be higher, but if you look at, project it in the next 10 years, that might happen because in literature, it's been demonstrated that it's possible to electrify short haul, completely, in fact. So, we are talking about trucks which run to 250 to 300 miles on average. So I think that's a good enough range for driving a truck within the city area. Now, the problem is when you think about, anything beyond that, long haul trucking and things like that, it again becomes a combination of factors. It's a combination of the available technology, the cost it is coming at, and like how the technology will learn in the future so that a lot of these technologies come at a price point that they can compete with diesel trucks. And to the second part of the question, the answer is I I mean, at this point, it's unclear for me, like how that would happen. I think we may want to, like, there's literature in this field which is trying to pick up, in terms of doing these analysis and thinking about these issues. However, more needs to be done. On the biofuels question, like, it's a question which has been around for many decades now, thinking about the constraints that it might put on food supply systems, the constraints it might put on land use. But like, I see a lot of analysis and projections which say like hydrogen is like the fuel of the future, and there are some contexts and use cases where that might be true, but using something which is which has been demonstrated feasible in one context and taking it as a more general application, I think it's a little erroneous in my opinion. I think we need to, as I mentioned, that what I foresee in my worldview is a polyfuel world where the end use, the local context, the cost, and public acceptability will govern a lot of these outcomes. I'll give you an example. Like, we're thinking about, there's work out there thinking about electrifying and automating trucks. Now, that's a technology for automating trucks. You might need like supportive roadway infrastructure. Now, if you think about, low income and countries and developing countries, many times that infrastructure is not there. So even if you might have a technology which is cost competitive and works in the European Union, the United States, it might not easily adapt to those contexts. And similar arguments can be raised for other technologies such as hydrogen and biofuels. So yeah.
Well, one of the things is that if you're looking at short haul trucking, most of those trucks cannot handle containers. So if I'm looking at movements of goods from the major shipping ports in the United States, they're containers and they have to go on heavy trucks. One option that's been suggested is to build short rail spurs of about 10, 12 miles, run containers off the ports to areas 10, 12 miles away, and then put them on the heavy trucks once you pass the population centers. The problem with that is to find land for the containers. That's not so easy, particularly in dense areas like Los Angeles. But there's been a lot of discussion around the Port of Long Beach and how to reduce the pollution in that area. And so that's one idea.
No, I think, there are different approaches we can take to solve a problem. Ultimately, an approach which will win in the end is, there are ways of thinking about it. Do you want it in the short term or in the longer term? In the case of the supply chain crisis around Californian ports right now, it's any analysis we might do or any projection we might do, they need the help now. So whatever goes in terms of even marginally benefiting them in the near term is something which should be prioritized, and which is what the Biden administration has done, to relieve the pressures on shortages around trucking drivers. The Federal Highway Motor Safety Administration is providing $30 million to states for expediting commercial driver licenses. They're starting an apprenticeship program there. But simultaneously, they should also think about, okay, like if we had a better intermodal infrastructure here, which was seamless and connected operations from containers to railroads or to trucks, I think that would be a more robust longer-term solution. Again, the investments which have been outlaid in the Infrastructure Act may be helpful there.
Although the trucking industry is a more powerful lobby than the railroad industry in the United States. And that has some problems with where the money goes and some of the public policy debates. I'm going to end with one last question, which is, again, going back to technical questions. You have spurred a lot of people who are serious analysts, and they were really impressed with your presentation. In fact, I didn't do this, but most of your presentations start out with kudos to your work, your analysis, and your persistence. So you have impressed a number of people today, so thank you. So maybe my last question. Could you discuss regression results a bit further, past the two coefficients discussed? What, the two or more. What were some robustness checks that you made?
So I think in addition to Black and Hispanic residents, if you look at the regression results, we also had population subgroups which were American Indians, Hawaiians, and Asians. There was a strong negative effect on the Asian subpopulation, and presumably because they have a higher median income and reside in areas which are away from highways or something like that. But in terms of robustness checks, I think we ran the same regressional specification at the county and the census tract level for the emissions inventory which we created. In additionally, we ran the same regressional specification, the national emissions inventory, both at the county and the census tract level. So I think across these four, the results seem to broadly hold true. Now, there are different arguments, or there could be different reasons around why this pollution is higher in these areas, and we're working on figuring out what could be the other interactive things that could impact higher pollution in these areas.
Priyank, thank you very, very much for a great presentation. I want to close by mentioning that the next seminar will be on March 7th and will be on solar geoengineering and US politics with Kelly Wanser from Silver Lining and Steve Homburg from the Environmental Defense Fund. So we'll see you then, and thank you all.
Thanks, sir.